We last heard Kant's phrase, by denying metaphysics, that he would deny reason to make room for faith. That's the pivot upon which we shift over to Kant's new ethics, as part of the modern synthesis. Kant looked at the modern morality of Hobbes and Spinoza and Locke. And although he applauded the principle of liberty, he thought it was based on a low conception of human dignity, that it was rooted in self-interest. He didn't quarrel with their fundamental assertions about human nature, that by nature human beings are passionate and self-interested. But he thought that the attempt to derive the moral principles from self-interest is a fundamental contradiction. So he will place morality on a higher ground. His great idea that morality is a categorical imperative, that it arises from a sense of pure duty, is made by way of contrast to the idea of a hypothetical imperative, which says if you want something, then you ought to do something else. If you want to lose weight, then don't eat too many carbohydrates. If you want to live longer, then you ought not to smoke. These are the classic expressions here of a hypothetical imperative. Kant thought morality had to have the form of a categorical imperative. You ought not to lie, period. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Well, how is Kant able to revive a notion of duty? If indeed it's been the core of modern philosophy to have a non-teleological nature, that is, no room for ethics to appeal to a perfection or a fulfillment of nature, of human nature. Well, we'll see this denial of metaphysics is actually the opening for morality. By putting morality on a basis other than nature, other than science, other than the mechanisms of the world, and rooted in a new principle, will be its salvation. One way of putting the principle is that the abandonment of nature is precisely the liberation of morality. See, Kant thinks duty must be pure and morality a function of pure reason. The empirical basis of morality that we find in Hobbes or Locke, he thinks is corrupting. It's corrupting because an empirical principle of action, he says, must be self-interest. And further, it's out of our control. See, there's the mechanism at work, the modern view of nature. So if we can find an a priori principle, it would have the character of law and duty, and it will be within each man's control. The empirical also has the problem from Hume that the empirical is particular, it's contingent, it just happens to occur. For example, Kant rejects the Aristotelian, Platonic, Thomistic notion that there is a content to the notion of happiness, a content from nature, that there is a natural law, a natural ethic a way by nature that we can discern what human flourishing is. Kant does still share with Hobbes, with Descartes and Locke, the idea that happiness depends upon appetite or whim and shifting preferences. Kant would agree with Locke that in vain did the philosophers of old inquire into the highest good, because it resolves itself upon appetite or preference. But no, actually Kant doesn't fully agree with Locke. He will say, actually, there is one thing we know that is good without qualification, and that is the good will. And the good will is independent of inclination or questions about happiness or virtue. So we could say here Kant is combining something from the ancients and the moderns. Although it's decisively more modern, what he's combining is a low view of human nature, that's the modern, with a high view of morality. Human nature is selfish. There's no highest good. The good is the pleasant. These are the principles of modern hedonism. On the other hand, Kant sees that morality must be above the useful and the pleasant, a theme of ancient philosophy. Kant goes beyond them both by taking morality out of human nature. Morality becomes a matter of strict law and self-legislation of a rational being. We'll see what that means exactly, but it's a form of the social contract, not empirically based, but another form of transcendental deduction. What makes possible morality will be some conception of duty and the free will. So this is where Kant is more modern than ancient, because he thinks freedom is the essence of human nature. Rousseau set him straight. That's what he says. The Enlightenment and philosophic ideal of autonomy, see, becomes the peak of Kant's ethics. See, again, he sifts through the modern project, the theme of mastery, and shifts from the mastery of nature to an independence of nature. He shares that, but sees the core is autonomy. Autonomy, autonomo, it means law from oneself, not from nature, not from God. These would be heteronymous, taking the law from another. So that's why the abandonment of nature is its liberation. The rationality of morality, that is free from any divine command, is its liberation and its purity on Kant's account. So Kant must find a way to develop or ground the moral law from within oneself, from within rationality. This is autonomy. Neither God nor nature, and certainly not the city and its customs. Now, just to get the overview here, it's this attempt to go beyond nature and have this pure notion of duty that makes it so fragile, that will make this Kantian synthesis brittle in some ways, although Kant still dominates modern moral thinking in many ways, the notion of duty and respect for persons and universalizability and fairness. One has to see there is a weakness in this account of morality. See, how livable is it to say we will act from pure duty, and that anything that smacks of inclination or desire or love is corrupting of morality. Or this idea that every decision must be out of duty. Again, it seems a bit unreal. There's also an absolutism of the Kantian morality, different from the idea of a natural law in Aquinas or in the religious tradition, which have their unconditional demand. But Kant seems to leave little room for real prudence. As a matter of fact, he accepts the Machiavellian definition of prudence, that it's a calculation of self-interest. It's more like cleverness. And we'll see this will be the opening of the final criticisms of the modern age, or I should say not the final ones, the beginnings of the criticisms of the modern philosophy, is this pure reason needs some embodiment. This demand for autonomy needs to be made concrete. So Hegel and Marx will be opening this criticism of the modern synthesis. But let's get to some of the text and some of the developments of this ethical view. The work we wish to examine is called the Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. In it, he talks about a transition from the common idea of morality to the philosophical one. The basic principles that he uses, I've already started to indicate, but the first one is to have moral worth, an action must be done from duty. Not merely in accordance with duty, but out of duty. That means that it must be done not for some inclination or some passion or out of some purpose to be attained, but from what Kant will call the maxim by which it is determined. The maxim. This will be a key idea in Kant. It is the reason for acting in its moral dimension. See, it doesn't depend upon whether the object of action is realized. Kant is relentlessly against utilitarianism or any outcomes-based morality. But also, to be from duty means, again, without any regard to the object of desire. So the classic idea of virtue is not at work here either. So how does he explain this maxim that makes our actions of moral worth? He says it's acting from respect for law. And we return to the notion of the categorical imperative. He says, I am never to act otherwise than so that I could also will my maxim should be a universal law. Again, there's a function of reason. Morality is a function of reason. Universality, he thinks, will ensure the purity of one's motives. See, that one does not act out of self-interest, nor acting out of an exception for oneself. But if you can universalize your act, or the maxim of your action, then he thinks that's the sign of its moral worth. So the examples he gives, lying. To lie, he says, cannot be universalized, because to universalize it, you would see the inconsistency. That if you had as a law that everyone could lie when they were in trouble, that anyone could perjure themselves to protect certain interests, however important they may be, he says you destroy the very notion of trust and truth-telling. His second formulation of the categorical imperative is that you should treat the humanity in oneself and others never as a mere means, but as an end in itself. Again, this is one of the aspects of Kant that is used by many as their first principle of morality. It goes well, see, with the high reading of liberal democracy. Respect for persons. It means not interfering with them, respecting their freedom, respecting their autonomy. Again, there's great truth in this. But it is, I think, there's going to be a problem we see with these formulations, which sound strange at first, but they have to be asked. One of them would be, who counts as a person? You see, although Kant's philosophy is based upon this high notion of morality, free from nature, it does beg the question, who is a person? That needs to be filled in with some more determinate notion of nature, being, scale of being and rank. That great Canadian philosopher George Grant, in his book English Speaking Justice, has said that with Roe versus Wade, jurisprudence has lifted a cup of poison to its lips, because on the one hand, it's based on the fundamental respect for the person. But on the other hand, it admits it can't say just who is a person, has no consistent notion of a person, and has allowed in a form of domination of one by another that he says will ultimately be corrupting of that great principle of Kant. Another problem with the universalizability would be that it tends to be also a minimalist morality. It's that same old problem from Locke and Hobbes. Although it has a higher grounding, there still seems to be a moral drift as to the ultimate purpose or meaning of morality. Kant can talk about autonomy, and that does have its higher meaning. But I think there still is an emptiness here about mere freedom without any purpose or sense of service or use of freedom for human flourishing. The final problem goes from morals to metaphysics, but it's at the heart of Kant's synthesis, and that is the question of freedom. Why be moral when all incentives are removed as a very condition for morality? Autonomy of the will is the supreme principle of morality. Well, this little question arises from the side of mechanism and the side of science, see, which Kant thinks he has stilled. And that is the question, are we in fact free? Morality and freedom are connected. There's a kind of circularity in Kant, that we are moral because we're free, and free because we're moral. But freedom has not been proven. We know it's an idea of pure reason and not really knowable. As a matter of fact, he admits the mechanisms of nature would say that we're not free. So here's his solution. The distinction between appearance and thing in itself allows us to regard ourselves from two different points of view. We can look at ourselves from the world of sense, the phenomenal world where we are completely determined. Desires and inclinations are no more than pushes and pulls. We are passive. We have a heteronymous principle of action. It's happiness. But that is subject to these whims and external influences. So this is man turned over to behaviorism or biology to study the causal determinations of behavior. But then Kant says, well, we can also think of ourselves as a member of the world of intelligence, of the noumenal world, where we are completely free and active and autonomous. So if we can at least prove that freedom is a possibility and consistent, we can adopt its point of view. But again, this metaphysical problem remains as to whether it's necessary to have two explanations of human action. There's that dualism again, plaguing modern philosophy. We have just one more form of the Cartesian dualism, the consciousness set against the world, absolute determinism against absolute freedom. It just seems to be an unworkable picture of what human beings are like. As I said previously on the noumenal notion of the self, what is the status of this transcendental ego? Can we say that it is? How is it related to me and you? To John and Jim, or Susie or Jane? I mean, they're all transcendental egos. Well, what good is it to have the particularity of a name or a place? It's an unsatisfying answer to what human nature is. I think we see here this final synthesis in Kant, making room for faith by denying reason, leads one last problem, and that is Kant does come back and say the moral, rational agent will believe in God, freedom, and immortality. Well, we talked about freedom here and the need for that as an assumption of morality. This very court of law could not exist without some assumption of freedom. But see, Kant can just assume it, and yet it's undermined by the mechanism, or we have the untenable dualism. And God, why God? Why do we bring that back in? Hasn't the modern age been either an elimination of or a redefinition of God? Well, Kant says it's religion within the confines of pure reason. It will be rational belief. We don't need the Bible. That will help, but it's a rational belief. Why? Because we've seen as principle of morality is you should act with no concept of happiness. Just do your pure duty. But that, again, that dualism leaves that question begging. From the time of the book of Job through Greek tragedies, the problem of the discrepancy of justice in the world and the happiness or misery of the just and the unjust is one of those existential questions which Kant then just glosses over. You do your duty, but we assume God will work it out. And yet again, there's no room for God in this world of mechanism. So it's an idea, and that's all. And immortality would also be a final basis for reward. Well, Kant, the great synthesis of modern philosophy, with Kant will bring the story to an end. The supremacy of practical life. That's one of the features of modern philosophy. But as I've said on a number of occasions here, he transforms these moderns so the practical goal is not just comfortable self-preservation, but moral perfection, autonomy. What he will then call a kingdom of ends. And that's the other side, as the great synthesis, as the autonomy of man, that stoic quest for self-possession. Kant did not hear the voice of Pascal, that prophet crying in the wilderness, about the problems with that stoic autonomy, set free from nature and custom. And then the last item to sum up Kant's great synthesis is that dualism, the pure inwardness of consciousness set against nature and pure extension, this alienation from the world, nature giving no support to morality. These will be things that will be taken apart in the 19th century. Marxism, existentialism, positivism, phenomenology, all continue in some way Kant's synthesis, with Marxism seeking to realize the kingdom of ends in time, existentialism taking the theme of man as homeless in the world, positivism with the project of modern science. I think I'll end with Gilson and Langen's conclusion of their book on modern philosophy. He says, the 19th century saw no new departure as the radical breaking away from scholasticism by Bacon and Descartes. But a new era began within the modern age. We are in that new era, and only a prophet could say how far we are from its end. We'll hear a prophet or two in our final session. In our last half hour, I would like to go over some of the rich resources that we have available of philosophers and theologians and scientists who have made great strides in coming to grips with modern philosophy. And I would like to begin where I left off with the statement by Gilson and Langen about only a prophet could tell us how long the modern era will continue. A great thinker, Romano Guardini, wrote an outstanding book in the 50s entitled The End of the Modern World. The end of the modern world is not an apocalyptic prediction of doom, but just a tracing of the trajectory of modern philosophy from the time of Descartes and Bacon. And seeing that in Guardini's view, the great themes of the modern age, he identifies in a way very similar to ours the element of technology and the discovery of human power as one. Number two, the idea of an autonomous personality. And three, he adds this notion of the idea of an artificial culture. I think we see a variation of that in our discussion of Hobbes, but the idea of a new culture bringing about a human happiness and fulfillment. And he thinks that we are entering into a new age, a postmodern age, in which, number one, the technology is seen to be something that has a mixed result. That power and its motive of lordship, he says, will seize hold of the naked elements of both nature and human nature. It bespeaks immense possibilities not only for creation but also for destruction, including the destruction of humanity itself. As far as personal autonomy, he says we've entered into the age of the mass man, where human personality is dominated by mass movements, mass notions and common notions of appetite and satisfaction. And he says he thinks we're losing the sense of the dignity of the person. And third, on culture, Maybe the best way to explain this is the underlying optimism of the modern age, of the Enlightenment, that human rationality can discover the principles of nature, discover principles of human and political organization, and create that new society for the benefit of all. Well, Guardini, looking back to World War I and World War II, said one of the things we must have learned is how weak culture can be, how weak the goodness of man can be in the culture that surrounds it, and that he thinks then the postmodern age will be coming to terms with these discrepancies and contradictions of modernity. I've already mentioned C.S. Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man, which also outlines this problem in very clear form. The subjectivism, the rejection of the Platonic notion of the order in the soul. C.S. Lewis lays that out with great clarity. And his ending chapter is about the mastery of nature, meaning the mastery of one man over another. And I think most of all, he has his argument against reductionism, which becomes part of the modern project that has to be reconsidered, that unity of method, the quest for certitude. These things we must see now have their limits, and we need to return to some broader idea of what human knowing is, to break out of the shackles of idealism and rationalism, and to recover some more integral notion of human nature. So another person I would have to mention that has been one of our guiding lights is Jacques Maritain. The title of his book, Integral Humanism. Again, written in the 30s, seeing this end of the modern world, or seeing the self-destruction possible if there is no countervailing principle, no recovery of the ancient wisdom. Maritain argues this need for a new humanism, or an integral humanism, which will take these great strides of the modern era. The respect for human rights, the exploration of nature, the use of technology for the benefit of mankind, toleration, respect for the person, any number of things Maritain sees as positive achievements of the modern era. But he sees them being undermined from within or contradicted by other principles in the modern project. So the new age, he says, the integral humanism will be one in which we can find this restored sense of being. We need a realistic epistemology and metaphysics. We need a broader sense of the unity and capacity of human beings. Maritain has a concern shared by one of the other great mentors I've used in describing modern philosophy for you, and that is Leo Strauss. His article on the 3 waves of modernity. We haven't heard about the 3rd wave yet, but the first being Machiavelli and the second Rousseau. The third is Nietzsche. Nietzsche is one of the figures looming beyond Kant, who will bring crashing down that great optimism and rationality of the modern age. He unmasks the contradictions. And of course, Strauss is writing to say that Nietzsche and the crisis of modernity that we see in Nietzsche, the will to power, the irrationality, should point back to Plato as an alternative to see that perhaps the moderns, in their fascination with the new science of nature and their fascination with Machiavelli, overlooked the latent resources within ancient philosophy that could address these issues and give us the more comprehensive view. So he's reopened the question of the ancients and moderns. Again, not to turn back the clock, but to say the modern principles are neither self-evident nor sufficient for understanding nature and man and God. So one way to do this recovery and to go back, I think, I'm just going to pick some more examples of some guiding thinkers in this quest to understand modernity and to have the more comprehensive evaluation of it. I think one good place to start is just a very short article by John Paul II and the Vatican, in which they go back to the Galileo case. This act of the Vatican and John Paul was superficially understood by the press, in which the Pope announced the Galileo trial and case has been finally resolved. It was seen in the headlines as that backward stumbling church finally catching up with modernity. But if one gets the short statement and read it, you will see a brilliant statement of the problems, honest problems of the Galileo case, anticipating these problems of post-modernity and pointing the direction to the more comprehensive view. Basically, his position was this, that yes, the church made a mistake in its condemnation of Galileo, but he says it's been turned into a myth by the modern mentality. That myth being the Galileo story is simply this: free thinker meets authority, authority bad, suppresses the free thinker. That's maybe one little distortion of the greater picture. That picture being, as John Paul outlines it here, is the emergence of complexity in our study of nature, the differentiation of different approaches, but leading to these problems that Galileo himself didn't fully recognize, that specialization leads to fragmentation, a fragmented view of the universe, or the desire to extrapolate the part to the whole. That's exactly the criticism of modernity we are making, that we see the problem with Descartes and Locke and Spinoza through Kant is extrapolating the part of mathematical physics, non-teleological nature, as if that were the whole. So John Paul says the challenge still remains to overcome specialization through synthesizing knowledge and integrating learning, and not extrapolating one part to the whole. And he says this requires a sophisticated epistemology about how to interpret Scripture, how to interpret the mathematical sciences. He says the birth of a new study requires clarification of all disciplines of knowledge to define the field, the approach, and its precise viewpoints and conclusions. This has some resonance in Cardinal Newman's idea of a university, that the knowledge, the circle of knowledge, is interdependent, and a change in one requires a change somewhere else. Or we need the mutual dynamic interpretation from various points of view, which the moderns did not allow. So if the church made the mistake of imposing one view on nature from the Bible on Galileo, and even that is a simplistic reading. We know if we see the details of Bellarmine's concern about the scientific evidence of Galileo's conclusions. As a matter of fact, the issue is not that the church rejects scientific progress or there's an incompatibility of Scripture and science, but this need to widen our perspective and recognize partial views for what they are, distinguish our methods, to break out of that rationalism and mathematicism, which will only have one method for all things, and also to break out of that arbitrary restriction that we must stick to just the empirical or the phenomenal. And John Paul says we need both the horizontal and the vertical perspectives to understand our place in the universe. Now, a lot of the groundwork for this has been done by Jacques Maritain. I'll mention him again. The Degrees of Knowledge is now out in paperback through the Notre Dame Press. Maritain, The Degrees of Knowledge, explains each type of method appropriate for various regions of investigation. It's a groundbreaking book. Yves R. Simon, The Great Dialogue of Nature and Space, compares Descartes and Aristotle and shows again it's a problem of method, and there's a failure to differentiate or understand the distinctiveness of mathematical physics and intelligibility, and that it's been extrapolated to include the whole. So many Thomists have used Aristotelian philosophy of nature and Thomas's commentaries to give us a way to appreciate exactly what the scientific discoveries are and how they have a wider context. I have to mention Stanley Yaki, Father Yaki's work, The Road of Science and the Ways to God, Gifford Lectures, which go through all the modern philosophers, from Bacon to Descartes, and Leibniz and Spinoza, showing how their philosophies are not true to what scientists do. Just to look at the real science of Galileo and Newton and see how what all these philosophers were doing, spinning out their systems, he says actually missed the instinctive middle of a scientist who's a realist, who knows he's studying what is, not just a phenomenal perception on his brain, but the design of a wisely ordered universe of a creator. Yaki shows that's just part of history of science, not an imposition of Catholic ideology, but an honest assessment of science and its history. I think we can also turn over to the side of ethics and see that certainly I've mentioned Maritain and Strauss have attempted to show we need a deeper foundation for liberal democracy, that the foundation given by Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, or Kant will not be sufficient for us to understand the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights. We need Aristotle and Plato and Thomas Aquinas, and they can be seen as profound thinkers who can take those insights of or concerns of the modern age for toleration and rights and limited government and give them a more sound footing and interpretation. Mention must also be made of Alasdair MacIntyre, whose inquiries about the history of ethics, again, has turned up once again these insoluble contradictions of modern philosophy, ending in Kant's claim that he has a universalizable system, true for all rational beings, with no particularity, no need for virtue, and so on. Any number of books could be mentioned by I could mention by MacIntyre, but I think three rival versions of moral inquiry may be a good one for a student to start. He compares Kant, Aquinas, and Nietzsche. And again, by developing each within its own resources, he shows the superiority of the ancient approach, that it's able to come to terms with what Kant or Nietzsche has to say, where those two have problems even getting out of their own realm of discourse to understand what others are saying. I may end with a selection from the church in the modern world. I opened with one passage, and I think there's some other great passages on the role of the church in elevating and saving even the temporal and scientific and moral achievements of modernity. And the time is right for that because of these problems and contradictions about power and the autonomous person and culture. The Council Fathers say that the Holy Spirit and grace will animate, purify, and strengthen the noble longings by which the human family makes its life more human and strives to render the whole earth submissive to this goal. See, it doesn't reject the mastery theme, but it sees the need for the purifying and strengthening of the human beings to achieve it. It says that the church will become the true defender of the dignity of the person because it has the resources intellectually and spiritually to give an account of what a human being is without the dualism or reductionism. And I think the main framework, well, here's the passage on human nature. It says, thanks to the belief in part rooted in the incarnation, but other fundamental views of the church, it says, thanks to this belief, the church can anchor the dignity of human nature against all tides of opinion, which undervalue the human body or idolize it. By no human law can the personal dignity and liberty of man be so aptly safeguarded as by the gospel of Christ. For the gospel proclaims the freedom of the sons of God and repudiates all the bondage that results from sin. It has a sacred reverence for the dignity of conscience and its freedom of choice, and advises that all human talents be employed in God's service. I mean, there's just some marvelous passages here about Catholics getting in the thick of the world and seeing these aspirations of the modern world and the fracturedness of the modern world. And, bringing a unique wisdom to it. And I think the basic framework would be, I will read a little bit, but to study section 36 of the Church in the Modern World, which talks about autonomy. In a way, this is the key issue in that socio-economic development of modernity, the differentiation of economics, politics, epistemologically, the claim for autonomy of science and thought, politically, the desire for autonomy. It's the key issue. And the Church Fathers say that autonomy has to be rightly understood. And it says, if autonomy of earthly affairs means created things and societies enjoy their own laws and values, which must be gradually deciphered and put to use and regulated by men, it's right to demand autonomy. He says the very notion of creation is things are endowed with their own stability, truth, goodness, proper laws and order, that man must respect and isolate them by appropriate methods. But, he says, the Council Fathers say, if the expression, the independence of temporal affairs means created things don't depend on God, that man can use them without any reference to their Creator, anyone who acknowledges God will see how false such a meaning is. So the idea of autonomy, if it means the proper integrity and proper principles of various regions of human activity and thought. The Vatican Council clearly affirms its support and encourages Catholics to respect that and develop it. But again, if autonomy means we deny that we come from God and depend on God, that grace can elevate and perfect human nature, then this is the false autonomy. The integral humanism will be the humanism of grace, of nature and grace. And that's why I think for my last figure to mention as a great teacher for students of philosophy in this postmodern age, it would be G.K. Chesterton. Certainly his book, The Dumb Ox, has a marvelous chapter on Thomistic realism and compares it with the madness of modern subjectivism. Again, done by a non-professional philosopher, but for that reason maybe all the more successful and appealing. And we can't forget his great book, Orthodoxy, whose very premise and description of orthodoxy is that it's characterized by great balance, by great integrity. And that's the romance of orthodoxy, is the gathering together of all those masses of contradictions that Pascal pointed out, of the grandeur and the misery, of nature and grace, of body and soul, of science and wisdom, and just go down the list. And Chesterton shows in the most humorous and instructive way how we live in a world out of balance, which seizes on one and now another aspect, which it emphasizes to the extreme, distorting, again, the integrity of experience and human nature. And that orthodoxy, he says, is that great balance, that great living balance of these apparent contradictions and dualities, which I think we've now seen the modern age played in its own way to emphasize the importance of the idealism, the contents of its thought, that rational method, and an untenable dualism. I think through the teaching of Chesterton and leading us back to Thomas Aquinas, and from Aquinas to Augustine and Aristotle, we will find that wisdom that I think we see is desperately needed in the postmodern age, as it finds its great modern achievements are now seen as ambivalent and marred by certain excesses. And Leo Strauss says it may be a choice between Nietzsche or Plato in one way, to see that we either have some notion of intelligible form and order through the logos, or Nietzsche's will to power and irrationality. So we must go back and read these moderns and see what hopes and ambitions and methods they roused up, but also understand their limitations and extremes, and try to bring back in various forms the ancient wisdom of the Greeks and the medievals.